All right, welcome everybody. We're still waiting for folks to get started. We've got already 40 people online. This is fantastic. We've had almost 100 people or more in each of these legislative webinars throughout the session, and we really appreciate all the interest and action that folks have taken. It's great to be able to have such an engaged supporter base, and we really appreciate all of your support and also all of your action. So thank you so much for being here today. We're going to give folks about 30 more seconds before we get started. While we're waiting, we'll get a couple of quick shout outs to Bob up in Grand Marais. Good to see you, Bob. Thank you for being here. Emily, thanks for joining us from MAUD. We appreciate having you on. Jackie Craig, running for Senate down in South Metro. Congratulations, Jackie. Good luck.
Retired Representative Jean McGuinness is joining us.
Jean McGuinness, nice to see you, Jean. Just really cool to see all the folks who are popping in. Judy Helgen's here. Kathleen Schuler from Health Professionals for Healthy Climates here. Libby Bent from Duluth for Clean Waters here. Luann Waddick from Stop Over Salting is here. Lori Andreessen from Save Our Sky Blue Waters. So many folks that we've worked with in the past and continue to work with. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We'll get started here. And just a reminder for folks who might not have been on at the very beginning, we will be taking as many questions as we possibly can this session. And if you have a question that comes up as you're listening to us chat a little bit, put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we'll get to that in the third part of our show today. And for those of you who are not on the very beginning as well, my name is Aaron Klemz. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and I'm joined by Kathryn. Hello,
thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule. MCEA as an organization is partially funded by foundations, but more than half of our funding comes from people like you. And the foundation specifically will not fund any lobbying work. So this legislative conversation that we're having is really driven by your donations. MCEA has the largest team of lobbyists up at the Capitol working on environmental laws. It's really critically important as a legal organization that we have good laws in Minnesota and that we protect the good laws that are already in place. And so our legislative program is really core to what we do, and we really appreciate your support to make it happen.
Yes, and I'll also add just that we're getting to the end of the legislative session. So it's time that you're here today. The legislative session ends May 23rd. So we've got just, that's not next Monday, but the Monday after that. So we're really in crunch time at the legislature. And the focus of today is really about money. It's about the funding streams that are used to support environmental work and environmental projects in Minnesota. It is an interesting and complex area, and one that MCEA has been involved in both in the courts and at the legislature to try to defend Minnesota's dedicated funds for the environment and ensure that those funds are available to protect our environment and to protect land, public lands, to address different emerging sources of pollution. And we're really proud of that work. But I wanted to start with just a kind of brief, a short explanation for folks who are more capital savvy. That this might be a little bit of remedial work, but I think for many people it's not. It's complex, and oftentimes when you hear about the Minnesota state budget, you're thinking about the general fund. That is the funds that are provided by state income tax, by state sales taxes, other general sources of revenue for the state of Minnesota. And actually, in the environmental area, there's not a lot of general fund spending. In fact, many of the funds that are used for environmental spending come from a variety of buckets. Some of it comes from the general fund, but a lot of it comes from dedicated funds. Some of those dedicated funds were established by the voters by establishing, for example, the legacy amendment or the lottery, and then dedicating those funds for a particular purpose. And then there's also other funds that have to do more with, some of it has to do with like payments that are passed through. So for example, Minnesota enforces some federal environmental laws and gets some federal funding to do that. Sometimes there are fines that are collected for people who violate environmental laws, and those are used actually to fund some of our environmental activities as well. Here in Minnesota this year, you've probably seen the headlines about a $9 billion surplus, and that's a little bit deceiving in that we already have spent a substantial portion of that. I think right now the number would be around $6 billion, which is still a lot. But also Minnesota has a really weird quirk, which is that back in the mid-2000s, we passed a law, the legislature passed a law that doesn't allow for us to project inflation on the cost of running government for the next biennium, but allows you to project inflation onto the sources of revenue. So it creates a very odd mismatch where we think there's more money coming in and we think that there's less money going out. And so I just want to make sure that folks are aware of that. So when you hear these numbers being passed around, that there's billions and billions of dollars in surplus, once you start looking at the inevitable growth, and as you know, inflation is going up, those costs are also being passed on to government programs, including environmental programs. The cost of hiring has gone up. All of that will increase the cost of administering some of these programs. One last thing I just want to mention is this is not a budget year, right? Minnesota budgets every 2 years, and we are in the second year of what we call the biennium. And so the discussion at the legislature right now is really about what they call supplemental budget bills. These are not, so if nothing happens, if the legislature wasn't able to reach agreement and they went home without an agreement, even on specific areas, nothing would shut down. We are a fully funded government through the end of the next fiscal year. And that's good news, but it also means that there's a little bit of less urgency to get something done. Sometimes the need to actually get a budget completed can be the thing that pushes some issues over the finish line. And too often, I would say too often, policy is getting blended in with budget stuff and making it so that sometimes the best way to get policy done at the Capitol is to link to budget items. And in a year where the budget doesn't have to get done, that can also mean that a lot of good policy can get left on the wayside if they can't reach agreement about the budget as a whole. One last thing I want to mention, I'm sorry, I've already said that twice, I'll try again, but there's a lot of federal money right now at stake. So some of this money has already been sent to the state in the form of American Rescue Plan or COVID-19 recovery funds. And there's still a substantial portion of money, I think somewhere around $2 billion left on the bottom line. Much of that was just agreed to be spent in hero pay and to replenish the unemployment insurance trust fund. But there's still some substantial amounts there. And lastly, there's a bunch of money coming into the state over the next several years from the IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And that money oftentimes comes with the requirement for a state match. And so there's been a lot of discussion at the legislature this year about state funding to kind of unlock some of the federal funds. And that includes a lot of areas that we're interested in at MCEA, including electric vehicle charging networks, transmission infrastructure to get renewable energy to market, and wastewater infrastructure and lead service line replacement projects for clean water. So that's another area of the budget that we pay attention to as well. And so the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Kathryn, to talk a little bit about dedicated funds, is that this is spreadsheet season at the legislature. And so every one of these bills comes with a very detailed spreadsheet. We track those numbers down to the penny and try to make sure that we're trying to spend that money as best we can to protect Minnesota's environment. I want to send this over to Kathryn for a minute, though, to talk about MCEA's work on dedicated environmental funding, particularly the lottery and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, but all of the different dedicated funds the MCEA works to protect.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So we have in Minnesota some constitutionally dedicated funds for the environment. And I want to say a little bit about what that means. So we have two constitutional amendments that put money towards environmental work. One of them is the one that you're probably most familiar with, which is the Legacy Amendment. The Legacy Amendment was passed in 2008. It includes money for drinking water, habitat, arts and cultural heritage, parks and trails, and also water resources, lakes, rivers, streams, groundwater. And so you've probably been to like a theater or an art festival or someplace like that where you've seen the Legacy Amendment logo. And that means that some of the money that was set aside from a sales tax is put into the fund, and somebody got a grant to fund that event that you went to. It's funded out of a sales tax, as I mentioned, and because it's set aside by the voters and it's in the Minnesota, it's enshrined in the Constitution, there's a limit to how much the legislature can change that, because the Constitution sort of trumps any sort of new statute. So that's one. The one that's been talked about most this session and is relevant to us at the moment is the Lottery Amendment. So the Lottery Amendment was passed in 1988. And it establishes a trust fund called the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, or ENRTF. You often hear people refer to the acronym. And the purpose of this is to create this fund that creates stable, long-term funding to enhance Minnesota's environment and natural resources for the benefit of future generations. That's the language that's in there. And so, and you can see, like you see the loon on the lottery, and that loon is because 40% of the proceeds from the lottery are going into this fund. And then each year, or most years, money flows out of this fund to then fund certain projects for habitat, as well as like innovative water projects. So why are we involved? Well, we were involved with both of these amendments the first time around. Of course, we like it as an environmental organization when money goes to the environment. But more specifically with the lottery amendment, we have a role as the lawyers of the environmental movement, which is, of course, one of our key roles as an organization. So in recent years, the Senate has been passing bills to raid the funds in the trust fund and use them for things that should be paid for out of the general fund. So isn't what the voters approved, it's other purposes. And so as the lawyers, our role is to go to court to protect that money. And so we've been in the position of having to monitor how these funds are used and then bring litigation if necessary. And so in Dayton, Governor Dayton's last term, right at the end of session, that session ended, as they pretty much all do these days, sort of at the 11th hour, behind closed doors, messy negotiations. And the final bill that he signed included an unconstitutional allocation of the funds, using those funds for something that the voters had not approved. And Dayton was mad about it. He didn't really like that, but it was this big bill negotiated at the end of the session. He felt like he had to sign it. He wrote kind of a, angry letter to go with it, saying he was mad about it. And so MCEA filed suit to hold up the funds. And in the meantime, we worked with a coalition of other groups to get a new law passed that undid that unconstitutional allocation. And that was actually one of the very first bills that Walz signed as a new governor. And honestly, this is a lot of work to do this legal work and monitor in it this way. And mostly it's the result of some language in the amendments that could be clearer. And so our highest priority in getting this lottery amendment passed again, and I should have mentioned the lottery amendment, the constitutional allocation ends in 2024. And so the goal is to get it up, enshrined in the Constitution again after that, so that it doesn't come out of the Constitution at that time, essentially. Our goal is to get language in there that's clear enough that it makes these litigation fights either unnecessary or easy for us because the language is clear. If someone tries it, it's kind of a slam dunk. The other priority we have for the lottery amendment is we would like to see more of an emphasis on spreading these funds around to rural communities and to communities, urban communities that wouldn't have access to it, particularly those communities that are overburdened by historic pollution. So one of the criticisms, which I think is real, of the amendment as it's currently designed is that it's hard to access those funds. You have to go through a fairly complex process. You have to have a proposal, a budget. You might need a lobbyist. You might need a grant writer. And then you need somebody to actually implement, monitor, and report on the work. And so you need a certain level of staffing. And so a university has the staffing, some counties and parks departments have the staffing, but not everybody does. Rural counties, for example, may not have enough staff to get through this process, so they do not access these funds. Lower income communities of color that could use the money for restorative projects, communities already suffering environmental racism, cannot access this money right now, but it would be helpful to them for cleanup, for river access, etc. And so the one thing we would like to see when this lottery amendment is re-upped is there's a proposal in that we've asked for, which includes community grants. And this basically makes the funds more easy to access for smaller grants with lower sort of overhead requirements for applications, budget, monitoring, reporting, things like that. I don't know if this community grants proposal will make it in. I don't think anybody does at this point. Will make it into the final version, but that would be a helpful. That's something that we support as well. So we think there's some tweaks that could be made, some changes to make this lottery amendment better. But overall, it's good money for clean water and habitat in the state, and we'd like to see it continue into the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's about $65 million a year right now, and there's about $1 billion in that Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund that was established in 1988. And that's that's a great nest egg for investing in Minnesota's clean water. I mean, and the thing is, like, I want to make it really clear that these are not like funds that are used to support, agency staff, for example, or just general operating support. These are supposed to be used to supplement and to take on new ideas and new projects, as opposed to paying for old stuff that we used to pay for through other means. And that's what a lot of the battles of the legislature are about, is about this question about whether or not this money is being used to supplement what we're doing, add to it, to do new things, or supplant, to replace, to replace funds that otherwise were already there. And that, honestly, I mean, I don't know, Kathryn, it's one of those things. It's a challenge, because like, it's great to have dedicated funds, but then the battle then becomes about how do you protect those funds from being misallocated and being used to replace existing sources of funding. And that's a battle that we're fighting at the legislature a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say, Aaron, that the vision of these constitutional amendments has not been fully realized. I mean, the idea at the time in 1988, when the lottery amendment was passed, in 2008 again for legacy, is that this supplement, not supplant language is used. And the idea is we will make more money available for the environment. But if you look at the long-term arc of how spending in the state has changed, that hasn't really worked that well. We do see general fund spending for the environment dropping. Even as we get the dedicated funds, so the overall spending kind of stays the same. And that dedicated fund, actually, that dedicated money actually has supplanted and not supplemented the spending, at least not nearly at the level of what we'd hoped. So I think there's probably a bit of a cautionary tale there about dedicated funding. At the same time, if the lottery amendment were not re-upped, it's not like we'd see that general fund money bounce back. I think we would just see overall environmental spending dropped. So at this point, I do think the best strategy is to continue with those constitutional amendments and try to make that, ensure that that money is spent in ways that make the most sense for the state.
Yeah. I also want to point out too that it's not necessarily that there's just something nefarious happening. I think one of the challenges is that as new environmental issues emerge, it becomes possible to use these funds to address them. So for example, think about PFAS and microplastics. These are issues that didn't exist in 1988. And so as we start to put our toe in the water about addressing these new concerns, it's easy to use these funds that are dedicated funds that are supposed to be used for new activities. But once they've been used for that purpose, then it's hard to get general fund support to take that on an ongoing basis. And so it's not necessarily that it's all about some kind of nefarious agenda to swap out money. Sometimes it's just that it's the march of time and the fact that we now know more and have different challenges than we did when these amendments were first passed. Yeah,
it's also the case that it's not like this trend of decreased environmental funding is specific to Minnesota, unfortunately. I mean, in general, we see that, the height of environmental funding at the federal level as well was some time ago. EPA's budget, gets cut pretty regularly. PCA and DNR do the same thing. It's good. I mean, and one of our legislative goals, of course, is to try to fight for more funding for those agencies because they play a really important role in protecting our natural resources and regulating polluters. But we do have a sort of, nationwide trend where it's hard to keep those entities funded.
Right. And in Minnesota, and as a lot of folks will point out, and accurately, that Minnesota has maintained our investment in our natural resources and environment, largely because voters have decided to take that on themselves. And I always marvel at the fact that in 2008, when our money was on fire and everything was falling apart with our economy, the people went to the polls and voted to increase their own sales taxes and dedicate those funds to the environment, clean water, arts, and cultural heritage. And it really shows, I think, the character of Minnesota and the character of the people who live here, that we made those investments, even at a time when it was extremely challenging. It would have been easy for folks to vote no, I think, at that point, but nearly 60% of the folks who went to the polls in 2008 voted yes for that legacy amendment.
Right, and we continue to see these constitutional amendments are very popular. That's still, I think you would get a similar, if not better outcome today.
Yeah.
But first we got to get it through the legislature.
Exactly right. And just so folks know, there are two competing bills right now being heard in both the House and the Senate around reauthorizing the lottery and the Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund. They are both in committees right now, and it's kind of late in the game. But it's still possible that we'll see a compromise emerge between the House and the Senate that will either put this on the ballot for 2022 or 2024. There are two different dates in the House and Senate versions of this legislation right now. And folks, just so you know, Minnesota's laws and rules about constitutional amendments are actually quite straightforward. In our state, you get something on the ballot to vote for the Constitution if a majority of the House and the Senate vote for it. The governor has no role in signing that law. If it's on the ballot, then a majority of the people voting in the election have to vote yes for it to pass. And that means that there are a lot of times folks will they'll vote only for president, sometimes in a presidential election year, or they might only vote for one race that they're interested in. Those votes, if they don't vote yes or no, count as a no for the Constitution. And so, if this is on the ballot, then the next step will be do a majority of folks voting in that election vote yes to put it on the ballot.
Right, and there's still disagreement about what this is going to look like. Is it going to look exactly like it does now? Or are we going to be able to get some of these tweaks in to avoid the raids, community grants, etc.? There's also disagreement about the year that this might show up on the ballot. So you can imagine certain parties have strong opinions about when they want an environmental issue to be on the ballot and how it will affect the turnout for their parties. So there's some jockeying over that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is in 2022, literally everybody is on the ballot, from the governor through all of the constitutional officers to every single member of the legislature. And so there's a lot more attention being paid to this election, I think, for good reason, because everyone knows that they have to face the voters this year.
Right. Do you want to, go ahead and move on to the bonding?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, I want to cover two things: the supplemental budget, which I think there's been some questions in the chat already. Sherilyn's got a question about environmental justice that I'll get to in a minute, as well as the bonding bill and what bonding is. So as I said earlier, the supplemental budget year, we've already got a budget. And so there's questions about whether or not we spend some of this additional money that we have in surplus right now on issues that are either emerging or that we didn't fully fund last session. And there's a really huge divide between the House and the Senate in the bill that's currently in the conference committee. The House has approximately $240 million in general fund spending set aside in that bill, and the Senate has $1 million. And even that $1 million isn't additional spending; it's actually a reduction in revenue from another dedicated fund. And so there's such a huge gulf. The question is there middle ground here? Do they find a few things that they can fund? That's still very much up in the air, and every day right now, in fact, right after this webinar, I'll be headed to the Capitol to observe and to take in the conference committee, which is being held every day at 1 p.m. Every other day it's online. Solely, this is the day that the Senate has the gavel. It will be in person with the ability to watch online as well. So you can watch that on either senate.mn or house.mn right after this webinar is over. A couple of things that I'll highlight, and I'll start with what Sherilyn mentioned in the chat, which is that there's a number of environmental justice provisions in the House bill that we really support, and that are kind of expensive, to be honest, in part because there's a lot of work to do to establish a baseline for how overburdened these communities of color, particularly, and also low-income communities are across the state of Minnesota. And so the House contains a bunch of policy language about environmental justice, but also funding to do air monitoring, to establish some rulemaking that would allow for people to consider cumulative impacts, so that there's multiple air pollution sources in a neighborhood. How do we bring down that cumulative burden on that community? And right now, I don't think there's a lot of common ground between the House and the Senate, to be perfectly honest, on this question. I think there was some actually reasonably productive discussion yesterday about why environmental justice is so important and what we mean when we talk about it. I don't know how far that will get down the road of compromise between the House and the Senate, but I do think that It's really promising. I think this session, the most promising thing that I've seen is that there's been really good work done by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and some of the other agency folks in terms of doing outreach to affected communities and trying to find common ground on how they want to define what environmental justice would be, what an area that's overburdened is. And those are foundational things that really need the involvement of the communities that are affected. And so that's been one of the more promising aspects of this session. I'm not sure that it will get over the finish line in terms of legislation, but the work that's been done by agencies to work with communities has been really helpful, and I think really has moved us forward.
Well, and different too. I mean, historically, you would have seen either environmental justice not being talked about at all at the Capitol, or it being talked about without those voices at the table. It would be people would be excluded, and it would be, you know, agencies and legislators sort of imagining what they think communities need, but without actually asking them.
Exactly right. Here's some other highlights that I'll just toss in here that I think are really worth thinking about, because it also involves rating and funds. It's not just that there's these constitutionally dedicated funds like the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the legacy funds. There's also funds that have been dedicated for specific purposes in state law. One of those is called the MLCAT, or the Minnesota Landfill Contingency Action Trust. It's a very jazzy name. But this is a really important fund because, as you know, we've been developing landfills to store our garbage and waste, you know, for many, many years. Many of them were initially put in the ground before we had strong environmental laws. And many of them were poorly designed, and they also sometimes commingled hazardous waste with household waste. And so we're now seeing two very, very large cleanup bills that don't really have a source of private funding starting to like loom on the horizon, in the Freeway landfill in Burnsville and the Pig's Eye dump in St. Paul and along Battle Creek. And unfortunately, with the Pig's Eye dump, the climate change is exacerbating this problem, where the water flow of the creek, which is right next to this dump, is getting higher and flashier. There's more flash flooding, and it's washing more contaminated sediment into the Mississippi River. So there will be a need to really accelerate cleanup. There's money set aside in the House version of the bill. There's not that money set aside in the Senate bill. And also in the House version, there's $29 million being repaid to the Minnesota Landfill Contingency Action Trust that was rated in 2005, I think. They've been paying it back $100,000 a year, and at that rate, it will take over 200 years to repay the fund, and we will definitely need it before that. So there's some things that really need to get done, and we're seeing some pretty big divides. We'll see whether the House and the Senate can reach agreement. The other thing I'll mention is the bonding bill. And just a quick refresher for folks who aren't familiar with bonding. Bonding is like the state's mortgage, I guess is the best way to describe it. It's long-term debt, and it's taken on mostly for projects that have long-term benefit and have statewide impact. So things like, you know, state buildings, like buildings on state colleges and universities, campuses, for example, or big pieces of transportation infrastructure like a light rail line or a large road project. You know, are some of the things that end up in the bonding bill. Generally, historically speaking, this session we're in right now is called the bonding year. The primary product of the legislature would be to create a bonding bill. But in recent years, bonding bills have happened kind of all over the place. Sometimes during a budget year, sometimes they get shunted off to another year, and sometimes we do more than one during a cycle. So there is still a lot of interest in doing a bonding bill at the legislature this session. Although neither the House nor the Senate has put forward a bonding bill yet in draft form, they have heard hundreds, I mean dozens, if not hundreds, of projects in their committees throughout the last 2 years to build a bill. And there's no doubt that they will be introduced at some point. A couple of things I'll just highlight quickly about the bonding process is because it requires a 3/5 majority or supermajority in both the House and the Senate. It requires votes from minority caucuses in each of the bodies. And so it can be both a thing that brings these caucuses together. It can also be a thing that allows one of them to veto a bill. And so it can be challenging to put together bonding bills that get the 60% approval of both bodies. And one last thing I'll mention about this is that there is some good stuff in here, potentially. So for example, we know that there's proposals to invest in our wastewater infrastructure, invest in lead service line replacement. Some of that can tap into some of these federal funds that came through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. You know, even projects that MCEA has worked on, like the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute's roof depot opposition and proposal to do an urban farm. There's proposals on the table to maybe try to find some money in the bonding bill to help accelerate that process and allow them to buy out the city of Minneapolis and move forward with an urban farm proposal. So we still haven't seen numbers and solid proposals yet. We do know that the chairs of both the House and the Senate bonding committee are working on bills, and the number we're hearing is around $1.5 billion. Whether or not that gets done, again, will really depend on the ability of all the caucuses to work together, because it will require the minority caucus, so the Republicans in the House, the Democrats in the Senate, and as well as the majority caucus is finding a way to negotiate what priorities are in there. And I see Cheryl's got another question about Pig's Eye. I will come back to that in a little bit. But bonding is a really important, source of funding. And again, because a lot of the work that we do, especially on wastewater and like big water infrastructure, that stuff lasts for decades. Right now, we're honestly paying the price for having neglected updating some of that infrastructure. And we're also paying the price for the fact that climate change has really accelerated the impact, both in deteriorating some of that infrastructure, but also demanding that we redesign how we control water and how we work on stormwater and other kinds of big public infrastructure projects.
It's also worth noting that drive for wastewater infrastructure will push the raids that we mentioned earlier on the lottery amendments. So the Senate in recent years will see the lottery amendment as a source for funding for that wastewater treatment. And that's usually what those raids are. And it's not, of course, that we don't think wastewater treatment should be funded. Of course it should be, but it's not within what the voters actually approved. So it's an unconstitutional use of it. It is appropriate to see the wastewater infrastructure money come out of bonding as a good way to handle that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it this way, like the $60 to $65 million that annually can come out of the lottery trust fund to be spent on projects. We know that there's probably about, I don't know, I think it's something $5 billion, I believe is the most recent number that I've seen in unmet need for wastewater treatment. So like you could tap that entire fund and use it entirely for wastewater treatment and there wouldn't be enough there. And there would be nothing left for anything else. And so That's part of the reason why using the appropriate source of funding is so important, because it's possible to overwhelm or overload a smaller fund to be used to solve a very large, important problem, but there are better sources of funding to do it.
Right, and that's happened because at the time, most of our wastewater infrastructure was built with federal money at the time of the Clean Water Act. So at the time they started regulating what comes out of the pipe and into the river, which is what the Clean Water Act does. And, versions of that passed in like 78 through 81. Of course, they had to pay for that. So there's a bunch of federal money and a lot of infrastructure was built at that time. A lot of it's reaching the end of its useful life, needs to be upgraded or replaced entirely at this point.
Yeah, and one last thing that's driving this bonding conversation right now are increasing interest rates, right? So if you've been following the news at all, you know that inflation is up. You also know that the Federal Reserve Bank is increasing the federal rate, and that spills over into bond markets and means that it's more expensive to borrow money, whether it is to borrow money to buy a home for yourself as an individual or for the state to finance wastewater treatment infrastructure. And so I think there is a lot more interest perhaps than there was at the beginning of the session about getting a bonding bill done, in part because the recognition that if they wait for another year, the interest rates could be 2 or 3% higher and make it much more expensive for the state to borrow money. Luckily, here in the state of Minnesota, we have a really strong fiscal history and really good fiscal management. And so we get good bonding rates when we put out bonds for sale. And that means that because we have good fiscal discipline in Minnesota and strong reserves, we can get lower interest rates, but we still are being affected by the same things that everyone's being affected in the interest rate market.
Yeah, for sure.
So I see some questions have popped up both in the chat and also the Q&A. And I think we're going to turn to some of these questions. And I want to start with Brian's question in chat. How can we, and I like putting we in quotation marks, it's a really good way of putting it, because I think it's all of us, do a better job of publicizing the funds available and accessing them so that citizen and neighborhood groups can access them.
Yeah, so I mean, the community grants piece that I'm talking about, to be clear, is not in place yet. I mean, that's something that we want to be part of the lottery amendment post 2024 when the existing lottery amendment runs out. So at the moment, there's not a lot of those funds available through the state. But once those are in place, hopefully that's something that both the state as well as groups like ours can help publicize and help people access it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to understate like how complex and how difficult it can be to get one of these grants. And I think that the other challenge too has been in recent years, especially for the Environmental Resources Trust Fund, the lottery funding. There's a requirement that for the committee that hears these proposals to make recommendations, they have to have 9 of 13 members vote yes. And there's been some partisan division on that committee that's made it hard to get to 9 votes. And so you have a situation where the LCCMR, the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, you're getting a whole bunch of acronyms today, who is responsible for recommending which projects to approve, is unable to reach agreement. And then it becomes kind of more of a political football for each body in the legislature to decide how they want to spend that money. It's a real concern. And I think, we've also seen bills proposed on the House side to change that process to make it a little bit easier to reach a recommendation. So it's not as easy for a small number of members of that committee to block a recommendation that the rest of the committee agrees with.
Right. There was somebody said in chat earlier, one of the criticisms of the existing system is that a lot of it does goes to the University of Minnesota actually to fund research projects. And I mean, I think people disagree about whether that's, a problem, because it is, I mean, the purpose of it, as the voters approved, is for research and innovative projects. And the university is one of the places where those things happen. And it is work that wouldn't otherwise, it's research that wouldn't otherwise happen and can have a big impact. But it's also, like, I think, emblematic of you need to be an institution with the level of sophistication of the U to really navigate the system. Yeah. So that is, I think, an issue.
So the process usually starts by people making a proposal. In fact, there is actually an RFP, or sorry, request for proposals open right now through May 23rd. So if it's a lot of work, and I wouldn't suggest if you're just thinking about it for the first time today, right, you're not going to get it done in time. But the way the funding cycle works is it starts with a request for proposals. It moves into a round where they basically like dive into each of these proposals. They make presentations to the committee, and eventually the committee makes recommendations based on that, and it slowly moves toward creating bills that the legislature approves. Ultimately, the legislature has to approve any appropriation, right? And that's part of the issue, is that, because the legislature is involved, folks who understand how to navigate the legislature have an inherent advantage in terms of acquiring and using those funds.
Yeah, Andrea had a related question about, what happens. I mean, there's the lottery fund money if it doesn't get spent, that just sits there. But then also we have all the surplus that you mentioned, like what happens at the end of the session to that surplus money if they don't pass a bill to spend it?
It stays there.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why there's a chance that things won't get done this session is because the parties involved might decide that they have more to gain by leaving that money on the bottom line and saying that they have a better idea about how to spend it when they campaign for November 2022.
Right. Or not.
Or not.
For some parties.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, there's not a lot of things driving us to an inevitable resolution, right? Minnesotans don't like it when their government shuts down, right? And we've seen that if we get to the end of a fiscal year and there's no budget and the government shuts down, there are consequences, political consequences for that, as well as actual real life consequences for people who depend on the services the government provides. But in this session, there's not the same level of deadline-driven activity. And I think if there's anyone if you follow the legislature at all, they need a deadline to get things done. I mean, it really does help to have a deadline driving us toward things like, so for example, the fix with the unemployment insurance and the hero pay was really driven by a deadline about the need to increase business taxes to start to refill the unemployment trust fund. And so they got it done just under the wire so they wouldn't have to increase those taxes. Similarly, on bonding, there's really the consequence of not passing a bonding bill is that those projects don't get done and that they could be more expensive to do in the future. Just generally speaking, costs for especially big infrastructure projects just go up just because of inflation and materials costs and stuff like that. But now we have the additional problem of the headwinds created by the increasing interest rate environment. So, you know, there's really, again, the consequences are we're not going to get things done that we should get done that will help serve Minnesotans and make our world a better place to live in. But otherwise, the money doesn't go away. It'll just be more expensive next time if we decide to do it money.
Right.
So
there's questions about Pig's Eye coming up.
Yeah, Pig's Eye is it's a really complicated one. I look at this. I am not an expert on this. I've sat through some legislative hearings about Pig's Eye, and I know a little bit about the expansion. There is the challenge here is that Pig's Eye is both in a kind of it's in a very vulnerable and ecological place. It's right there on the shore of Mississippi River, right? And of course, we know how important that is. This is also historically, I called it a dump, not a landfill, because it was really established well before we had strong environmental laws. And we know that there's really nasty hazardous waste problems on that site, and also difficulty assigning it to a responsible party. The way the federal Superfund cleanup law works is you try to identify who's responsible, and they actually have pretty powerful tools to go back and find who did it. I mean, I worked on a case in Illinois once where they went back to the owner that bought the company, that bought the company, that bought the company, that bought the company, that bought the company. There were 6 generations of companies being purchased before they found a responsible party.
Well, in the case of a landfill too, they can look at everybody who brought garbage or waste to that landfill. So you can imagine the universe of potentially responsible parties, as they call them, or perps. Yep, they call them perps, are is sort of infinite. But you know, that also means it's a huge legal rigmarole and so forth. It is, you know, I heard the new Region 5 director for EPA speak a couple of weeks ago, and she mentioned something that I didn't know, which was that infrastructure, that bipartisan infrastructure bill that's passed, does include a re-up of the tax for the Superfund. So there's the expectation that there will actually be, I mean, the super fund is really not funded, barely. And so there's an expectation that there will be quite a bit more money available for cleanup the sites. Now, whether any of that goes into Pig's Eye or not is, you know, unclear. I mean, it tends to be a process. It is a process to designate a fund within a state, and you kind of have to have the state support and cooperation and, you know, and all the criteria there. So I don't know if that means it goes to Pig's Eye. At this point, we're really talking about state funds, but I do think there's going to be a lot more money available at the federal level that could be helpful at some point as well. Yeah.
Joseph's got a question, and I think Andrew just answered it too, but I'll answer it here as well, and because it helps to explain what MCEA is and how we work. So Joseph's question was, does MCEA have a dashboard of legislators and how they acted or voted on MCEA initiatives? So MCEA is a 501c3 nonprofit. We don't engage in electioneering or partisan advocacy, right? So one of the challenges of like report cards of that sort, where you like identify people by vote, is that oftentimes it's associated with different kinds of more partisan or more electoral advocacy. And so we don't do that as a practice at MCEA. There are a number of other organizations, including Clean Water Action and Sierra Club, that do similar kinds of report cards at times. I don't know about specific examples, but I'd encourage you to look to some of those groups to provide that kind of specific fine-grained output on what specific legislators did. We do oftentimes, like when we're using our social media, we'll post a vote board and tell people how their legislator voted. And people are definitely encouraged to reach out to their legislator individually. I also just want to use one more thing, just because we're getting to the end of the session. If you care about something in the legislature, tell your legislator about it. And you don't have to be an expert about it. They don't expect you to be. Right? In fact, I think the one thing that I hear most often from folks is, you know, saying that I thought I really care about this bill, but I didn't think they wanted to hear from me. And I'm like, you know, they do. And even if they don't, probably all the more reason to call them and tell them. You may not speak directly to your legislator, but you might be able to leave a message with their assistant or their staff member. Those get tallied and turned over to people. It's worth it. And so if there's something that you've heard today that you want to reach out to your legislator about, I'd encourage you to like use our website and the shaping policy section of it under How We Win, which has got a lot of resources about our testimony and bills that are at the legislature. And I think, that there's a lot that you can do to help push this along. So, and I think it always even just helps to tell your legislators that you care about the environment and you want to see them invested in it. I mean, you don't have to be listing, a specific appropriation you want.
I'm always amazed when I talk to legislators and they will tell us, oh, my constituents really care about this. It's really important. And they'll say, I got 8 phone calls, right?
Yeah.
There are, 60 people on this webinar today. I mean, if each of you called your legislator, like that would actually have a really big impact, calling up your legislator and telling them what you think. Like you'd be surprised how low the bar is to actually have an impact. You would think, oh, they must get dozens of calls. They don't. Like if you call and tell them, 6, 8, 10 calls actually has a really big impact.
Yeah, and as we move into like legislative election season, and again, MCEA is not an electoral organization, but I will tell you that you'll have the opportunity maybe to talk to one of these candidates on your doorstep and telling them that you care about environmental issues and you want to see clean water and climate justice prioritized, and ask them what they're going to do about it. That's an important thing to do. So as we head into that part of our political season, as we leave the legislative session, I would also really encourage folks to look around for resources, especially for organizations like the Sierra Club, Clean Water Action, and others who have either political action committees or 501c4 organizations that do electoral work, and they'll have more resources that you can use. But I really encourage you to bring it up if you care about it.
Yeah. There's a question from Tom Casey about working on or stopping sort of boondoggle or special kind of pork projects within a certain legislator's district under the lottery fund, which I think is really an interesting question. I mean, the system as it's set up now is supposed to avoid that, right? Like they take the money and it's supposed to be allocated by this committee, and there are some legislators on that, but there's also citizens, and it's supposed to take some of the politics out of it. Then they make a recommendation of how to spend the money that goes back to the legislature. And this, of course, is when the problem arises, right? So you get one of two things happening. Either the committee does not come to consensus, which has happened, or the legislature doesn't accept the recommendations as they were made, which has happened. One of the ideas that we floated as we're, putting this new lottery amendment in place is essentially having the legislature allocate the money first and then leaving it to a citizens committee to allocate it to try to take the legislative out of that process. The legislators that we talked to, and probably an unsurprising turn of events, did not love this idea. They really wanted to continue to be part of that. But I think one way to do this is that we've tried to hold the line, and I know that we've had action alerts for folks on this as well, to tell your legislator, stick to the recommendations from that committee, like don't deviate from it, and to try to honor that as much as possible. And there are reasons why that hasn't always been successful, but there are legislators that feel that's really important, and telling the legislator that you feel that's important is also a really good thing to do, because it does tend to avoid some of these like so-called pork projects.
One other thing that's worth noting, and it's kind of complex, but I'll try to make it simple, is that the process itself for how to decide what recommendations to move forward is also a problem. And so one of the challenges there is that, pardon me, the way that they do it is they oftentimes will have like basically members of the committee say, hey, they'll put a sticker next to a project that they like, right? And so it tends to be kind of a little bit of horse trading about this is in my district, or I care about this particular proposal. And there might be a better way to do that, I think. So it looks like there are some internal processes they could change to try to make that a little bit less likely. Oh, good.
Okay.
We got an odd error message. I saw.
Zoom was giving us threatening messages, but yes. I think it's fine.
I think we're, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I think we are pretty much at time here. Oh, we do have more questions. Are we scheduled to go to 1? I guess we have a few more.
We can take a couple more questions. I think, you know, I mean, one I want to address from Libby in the question is about, for the bonding bill, are there efforts to limit new road building given the large cost to fix and upgrade and update existing infrastructure and their oversized contribution to pollution and climate? That's an excellent question. Because I think everyone recognizes at this point, and we even have goals in our statutes and in our work plans for agencies like the Department of Transportation to reduce vehicle miles traveled. To try, because I think that's one of the key things to reduce the pollution, the climate pollution and other air pollution that comes from transportation, especially cars and light trucks. And I think right now the answer, unfortunately, Libby, is that not as much as there should be. There should be more thought being put into how we avoid what we know to be true, which is induced demand. If we build more roads and we build wider roads, we build more lanes for roads, we tend to increase the problem. And ultimately, we increase our ongoing cost of maintaining all of that stuff. You know, there's a lot of different kinds of solutions, and we're really interested. We had a presentation from folks here working on the Twin Cities about how to turn I-94 into a boulevard as opposed to a freeway. I mean, we also have to realize that what we have right now in terms of our infrastructure and freeways, that didn't exist even 60, 70 years ago, right? This is, we're literally maybe one lifetime into this new, I would call, experiment about how we organize society around our roads and our transportation infrastructure. So it is really good it's good that you raise that question. We continue to raise it with our concern. But as far as the bonding bill is concerned, unfortunately, too often it's about how much concrete you can pour to create as many jobs as possible. And I don't think there's as much thought put into climate as there needs to be. I think that's changing. And I think that the leadership, especially in the House, Representative Lee, who's the bonding chair, is a really strong environmental ally and gets these issues. And I think that they're starting to get a lot more play. But as far as having specific policies in place, I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot more opportunity for that at the federal level at the moment, because there is that money going for EV infrastructure, as well as, Aaron, you mentioned the I-94 project. I mean, much like our wastewater infrastructure, our highways are reaching sort of the end of their useful life in a lot of ways. So there's a ton of money going into highways, which doesn't have to be bad. Like, it could actually rethink some of these highways in a way that encourages less traffic, alternative use of these corridors and so forth. And so there's some thoughts going on around that. But I would say the federal conversation is probably ahead of the state conversation on this front at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to really like to nail it down, I think like the bottom line is we have to reduce the amount of people driving, especially driving their own one-person car. I mean, like that problem is not changing. It's getting a little bit worse even, right?
Yeah, and the vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah, and so having strong investments in mass transit is a way to do it, finding ways to encourage folks to mode shift. And a lot of this kind of land use patterns, these are things that, you know, I live in Fridley, a community that was built in 1954. It was meant to be driven in and out of. It's going to be hard for us to find ways to reorganize some of our suburbs and other places that were literally built around the car to adapt to a climate changing world. But we have a lot of opportunity there too. So we're just kind of at the beginning of that conversation. Unfortunately, we have a long way to go.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. There will be a recording of this webinar if you want to share it with your friends or you missed a portion of it. We really appreciate you tuning in. We also want to just reiterate how much we depend and need your support to do this work. There's been a link in the chat, but if you just go to our website, there's a donate button at the top if you're really interested in helping support this work. As Kathryn said, a lot of the legislative work are stuff that foundations to support a lot of our energy and other kinds of legal work just can't touch. And so your support as an individual really helps us have that robust presence in the legislature, make sure that when bad ideas come up, people know about them, and that we are able to talk directly to decision makers to make sure that we're moving us toward climate justice and clean water at the legislature. So
right, and we do have a match happening between now and the end of the year. Our fiscal year ends on June 30th. And the good folks at the SMICUS Foundation have offered a $50,000 match. So right now your impact will be doubled. So go give your gift today. It's a great time to do it. And thanks again for your support and for joining us.
Yes, thanks so much. We're MCEA. I'm Aaron Klemz. This is Kathryn Hoffman. And we'll see you hopefully in a couple of weeks with a recap of what happened at the legislature and how it went well. That's our hope anyway.
Right. Exciting conclusion.
Thank you
Have a
so
good
much.
one.
Bye.